We're going to continue with the English Civil War here. We talked about the ongoing disagreements between Charles I, the Stuart monarch, and the Parliament. Charles's need for money, Parliament's increasing resistance to Charles's sort of oppressive and autocratic rule. Again, Charles has apparently no political skills at all, continually alienating nearly everyone who comes into contact with. And now here he and the Archbishop of the Anglican Church are trying to impose the English prayer book on the Scottish Presbyterians. And this creates a genuine civil war in England. The Long Parliament, so called because it remained in session from 1640 to 1653, triggered the biggest revolution in English history. Scholars have traditionally argued that the crisis of the 1640s was a contest over religious and political principles, a contest between Puritanism and Anglicanism, the Anglican Church or the English Church, which to all appearances closely resembles the Catholic Church. A contest here between parliamentary self-government versus royal absolutism. So where does the power lie? What path is England going to take? The crisis of the 1640s is usually called the Puritan Revolution. We can call it that. It constituted the last and the grandest episode in the European age of religious wars. The Puritans and political radicals had hardened into a truly revolutionary party bent on reconstructing the church and the state. In reaction to this, a royalist party is formed to resist further change. In January 1642, Charles I tries to break up these parliamentary radicals with a sort of a palace coup. He enters the House of Commons. He's backed by 400 armed soldiers. He intends to seize these parliamentary leaders, but they've been tipped off, and they escape before Charles arrives. The word spreads through the city. The London mob sort of rises up in anger and indignation. Charles and his followers flee London. Within a few months, both sides are raising troops, and this war is on. So we have the Cavaliers fighting for the king, and the Roundheads fighting for Parliament. The Roundheads because of the haircut. The Roundheads controlled the wealthiest parts of the country. They held London and sort of the populous southeastern part of the country. Parliament collected large sums of money through excise and property taxes, far bigger levies than Charles I had ever attempted. A little irony there. For the first couple of years, Charles's army tended to hold the upper hand here. I heard one historian say that this is mainly because the parliamentary forces were still hesitant to attack and defeat their king. It's a powerful tradition, difficult to go against. The tide turns, though, in 1643 when Parliament secures a military alliance with the Scots, where this thing all started. And then the next year, sort of an alliance between Parliament and Scotland. That army wins a big battle at Marston Moor. And then emerging from this conflict is a Puritan soldier of great ability, Oliver Cromwell. So let's talk about Cromwell for a moment. His dates, 1599 to 1658. Cromwell creates what's called the New Model Army. It's a parliamentary army, and it decimates Charles's remaining forces at Naseby in 1645. The king is taken prisoner in 1646, and he remains under guard for the next 2 years. In 1648, Cromwell crushed a Cavalier uprising on the behalf of the king. His army entered London and executed the sort of military coup against Parliament that Charles had failed to do in 1642. Now Cromwell was in a position to resolve his differences with the king. Cromwell was convinced that Charles I was the chief remaining obstacle to peace. Cromwell determined that the king should be killed publicly and with great solemnity. Charles I was sentenced to death as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy of the people of England. On January 30, 1649, he was beheaded outside his banqueting hall at Whitehall in London. Before death, Charles says, "I am a martyr of the people." A mass executioner severed his head with a single stroke of an axe. At first, the king's execution was very unpopular, but Cromwell didn't believe he had much choice. He thought it was pointless to negotiate with Charles, who simply refused any sort of Puritan state in any form. Cromwell believed it was unsafe to leave Charles in prison where people might rally to him. You see this happen again in history. I'm thinking now of Nicholas II, whom we'll talk about. In the First World War, Nicholas abdicates the throne in 1917 and then is later murdered by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Again, there was a fear that the sheer presence of Nicholas might rally troops to him and create opposition. I think something very similar is happening here with Cromwell's decision to kill Charles I. So, from 1649 to 1660, England was a Puritan republic. The Puritans have prevailed. In 1649, Cromwell crosses the sea and conquers Ireland with great slaughter of Catholics. Cromwell does something that had not been achieved before. He cobbled Ireland and Scotland and England into Great Britain. Cromwell remains a controversial character, much hated in Ireland, as you can imagine. He does not appear to be a conscious dictator, however. Religion mattered to him, and he offered Puritans of every description the liberty to seek spiritual grace in their fashion. He dies in 1658. There's a series of ineffectual governments that follow Cromwell's death. None of the New Model Army officers had the stature and authority of Cromwell. But the army had gained great power and could not be dislodged, despite the bankruptcy of the revolutionary cause by this time. Finally, in 1660, one of the New Model Army generals arranged for an election of a new parliament, and this new parliament promptly invited Charles I's son to return to England from exile and to resume the Stuart monarchy. You can't make this stuff up. So a new era begins with a sort of second part of the Stuart monarchy. It's worth noting here in conclusion that the task that the Puritans started would be completed finally in the English Revolution of 1688-89, what we call the Glorious Revolution. And that, of course, is our next topic. So let's begin the Glorious Revolution here, and then we'll take a break and finish it up. A couple of contexts here. The Glorious Revolution represents the end, finally, the Stuart dynasty, which had dominated the 17th century. And it ends this period of religious conflict in England. So Charles II, the son of Charles I, who had been beheaded in 1649, he returns from exile to resume the Stuart monarchy. A little background here. The English people had sort of worked this Puritan crusading spirit out of their system. They were sick of army rule. They were sick of blue laws. You couldn't play cards. You couldn't dance. You couldn't sing. You couldn't drink. You couldn't sort of live your life in this Puritan republic. So the people generally welcomed the return of Charles II and the Stuart monarchy. Charles II ruled from 1660 to 1685. Again, like a lot of kings that we've encountered, he needed to increase revenues to enhance his financial power. The result was a series of what we call the Navigation Acts, and you'll run across these when you study American history. These Navigation Acts are the perfect embodiment of what we think of as mercantilism, this notion that there's a limited amount of wealth out there in the world, and that each nation state it behooves each nation state to accumulate this wealth. The Navigation Acts require that imports to England be carried there directly from the country of origin, and that the ships belonging either to that country or to England. In other words, cut out as many middlemen as possible, enhance the financial wealth of the kingdom. What does it say here? Between 1660 and 1700, the value of English imports and exports climbed 50%. Its merchant marine more than doubled in size. Customs revenues nearly tripled. The English had replaced the Dutch as the business leaders of Europe. So you can see that there's kind of an explosion here of commercial activity under Charles II. Now, in the New World, you'll see that the Spanish, having conquered the Aztecs, conquered the Incas, extended their rule into Mexico and to the west of what today we'd call the United States. On the other hand, you see the English colonists are sort of hugging the coast of the Atlantic seaboard from Maine all the way down to Georgia. They seem to be hesitant to explore that vast continent to their west. The English have a difficult time with the Indians as well, unable to make the Indians either work for them or pray with them. They seem to possess, on the other hand, a certain self-confidence of establishing English rule in the New World. Each colony had its own representative assembly. Again, you see this notion of constitutionalism. So Charles II is presiding over an expanding English empire, and a quite prosperous one as well. Let's take one more break here, and then we'll come back and finish the English Civil War by finishing the Glorious Revolution. Thank you.